In the previous session, we found what were the important points that Wordsworth had to make in his Preface to Lyrical Ballads. That included his treatise, his ideas related to emotions, feelings, subjectivity, individuality, among others. In this session, we would look into the shortcomings of the preface. As I told you earlier, the preface was not without its shortcomings, and Coleridge was one of the critics who pointed out to some of the glaring errors that were made by Wordsworth. Let us begin this session with the shortcomings of the preface. The preface has its inadequacies. Coleridge criticizes it for the unnecessary obscurity of its latter half and the extreme elaboration of certain clarifications regarding the use of language and constrained use of diction. Garrett mentions that the preface is a propaganda pamphlet and suffers from, I quote him, exaggeration and undue emphasis, unquote. He adds that Wordsworth frequently goes to extremes. Often it is inappropriate in argument and conventional in expression. Some critics also note that the preface is not prudent enough that it could be considered the introduction to a collection of poems. One of the glaring modifications made by Wordsworth in the Lyrical Ballads was shifting Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, from the beginning of the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads and including it as the penultimate of the first volume of this edition. The preface also proves that Wordsworth sometimes sounds pedantic, arrogant, and absurdly defensive, and makes bold claims for his poems that may not be justifiable. He declares that his poems may not be appreciated and the reader has to proceed cautiously to understand them. Despite this word of caution, the account he gives of the poems is misleading since they are much more diverse than the preface suggests. Coleridge may have been justified in assuming that it was this edition of the preface which annoyed the critics from 1802 onwards. Let us now move on to the significance of the preface. Despite the limitations, the preface is probably the most distinct critical document in the history of English criticism. It helped to bring about a divergent perspective regarding poetry and the theory that Wordsworth most sought after. It gave valuable and fresh insights into the nature, scope, and function of poetry and into the creative process. It set new standards for discussion of such matters by its intense seriousness and by the grasp of inward experience. Smith and Parkes point out that the preface raised a wall between the 18th and the 19th centuries. It dated a new era. It served to make intelligible forever the dividing line between the two regions in criticism that might otherwise have seemed to flow into one another. We do not often have many such dividing walls. This criticism by Smith and Parkes raises issues regarding the differences in opinion between the critics, poets, writers of the 18th century and the 19th century. On comparing Wordsworth's preface with previous writings of poetry, it could be concluded that the preface is a profound document of abiding significance. It has the distinction of being the first critical account of the process of poetic creation and the first comprehensive attempt to build up a theory of poetry. The preface poses numerous questions and promotes discussion of poetry, rhyme, meter, and other aspects related to poetic creativity. In the previous discussion, we discussed about the conception of the poet according to Wordsworth. Rather than just providing a conception of the poet, Wordsworth arrives at a democratic conception of the poet. What exactly does Wordsworth mean by democratic is what we have to pay attention to. Wordsworth receives acclaim for having democratized the conception of the poet. According to him, the poet is essentially a man who is different from other men in degree and sensitivity. He possesses certain gifts in a higher degree than others. He has a livelier sensibility and a more comprehensive soul. He has greater power of observation, imagination, and communication. He thinks long and deep. Others also have these gifts, but the poet claims to have these attributes in a degree higher than them. Wordsworth emphasizes his organic oneness and emotional identification with other men. The poet partakes the joys and sorrows of common men and writes for their pleasure. All that we have said so far about the poet is true with Wordsworth, because Wordsworth decided to enjoy, decided to take part in the sorrow, decided to have emotional identification with the rustics. This probably no other poet has ever done previously. In spite of discussing some of the greater aspects or some of the glaring aspects of the Romantic age, let us see why the Romantic age attained significance, probably because of the discontents with 18th century poetry. Wordsworth is dissatisfied with the poetry of his times for several reasons, and so in his preface he claims to have written poems which are truly different from the earlier ones in their matter, manner, content and style. Now, when I say Wordsworth is dissatisfied with the poetry of his times, I mean the earlier period, which is the neoclassical age. The poems he chooses are related to the incidents and situations from common and humble life. By humble life, I mean the life of the rustics, and he has tried to make them look uncommon and unusual by using imagination. When we talk about imagination, we cannot rule out the contribution made by Coleridge, because Coleridge was the first critic who talked intensely about imagination and the role of imagination in poetry. Imagination is considered as the soul of poetry. The neoclassical poetry is rather trite because it merely deals with the life of the fashionable upper class London society. Dry in content, intellectual in tone, and the emphasis on correctness, good sense and reason, neoclassical poetry lacks warmth, genuineness and realism in expression. Emotions and passions are essential for stimulating the appropriate feeling, and the Romantic age gave a lot of importance to emotions and passions. Emotions and passions means genuine emotions and passions, and not those emotions and passions that are a result of upper class enjoyment. Neoclassical poetry lacks this feature just as it lacked imagination. Most neoclassical poems were rational, they used logic, and they weren't the feast of the common man. Wordsworth's poems are distinguished from contemporary poetry because he has been successful in arousing feelings in his poems. The interest of the readers is important to create sensation through situations and incidents. Under the influence of the German tragedies and horror novels, poets make use of the sensation to thrill and excite interest. The result is that the discrimination of the readers had been blunted. Wordsworth has used the ordinary and the usual and has tried to make it interesting. Generally, the ordinary or the usual is not interesting. Whoever is bothered about the life of the rustics? This was not the way in which Wordsworth wanted to express the life of the rustics. And so he has tried to stimulate the deadened sensibility of his readers by relying upon feelings and emotions rather than on gross and violent stimulants. Wordsworth considers the poetry of Pope and his school to be mean and trivial. It lacks noble and worthy purpose. He has written poems which have purpose and meaning. His constant habit of reflection and contemplation has made him discover general and universal laws of human nature, and the result is that his poems are likely to enlighten the readers and strengthen and purify their affections. This end is not fulfilled by neoclassical poetry, and so Wordsworth could not accept it. It is precisely because he was trying to defy neoclassical precepts that he decided to write the preface, so that he could tell the readers what exactly he would want to do with the poems that he discusses about. Falsity of description is yet another drawback of neoclassical poetry. The poets do not look steadily at the objects, and so they fail to mirror man and nature faithfully. Their renderings of nature are inaccurate and pedantic. Wordsworth's poems, on the other hand, are characterized by truth to nature. What I mean by truth to nature is truth in the depiction of the life of the rustics. Wordsworth has looked steadily at his object, and so he has been able to look into the heart of things. Contemporary poetry, in contrast, is concerned merely with superficialities, while Wordsworth in his poems has tried to search for the reality that lies beneath. Wordsworth has given the soul of things and not merely the outward husk. Just as Wordsworth is dissatisfied with the subject matter of the poetry of his contemporaries, he is dissatisfied with their style and diction. The language of his predecessors is highly artificial and unnatural. As their poetry lacks nobility of substance, they tried to impart elevation to it by the use of personification, circumlocution, peculiar phraseology, and imagery. The result is that their poetry is as remote from real life in its language as it is in its subject matter. Wordsworth has chosen his subjects from common life and uses the language of common men. In this way, he has tried to bring poetry back to life both in theme and treatment. He has avoided personifications, conventional phraseology, and imagery of Pope and his school. Wordsworth has also refrained from the use of mechanical and artificial devices of style in his poetry. Explaining all this, it would be necessary for us to find out what exactly did Wordsworth mean by the function of poetry, or what meaning did Wordsworth attach to the function of poetry. Wordsworth defines poetry as, I quote, "the most philosophical of all writings, the breath and final spirit of all knowledge, the impassioned expression that is the countenance of all signs, the image of man and nature," unquote, to mention a few. In one of his letters he writes, I quote, "Every great poet is a teacher. I wish either to be considered as a teacher or as a nothing," unquote. In one of the celebrated passages of The Excursion, he writes that poetry has its value and significance in framing models, I quote him once again, "to improve the scheme of man's existence and recast the world," unquote. By meaning recast the world means to see the world in a newer light and not the way in which the neoclassics saw the world. In the preface, Wordsworth underscores that the function of poetry is, I quote him once again, "to produce excitement in coexistence with an overbalance of pleasure." The meaning of coexistence is the way in which man and nature live in harmony with each other, giving more importance to pleasure. In his emphasis on pleasure as a primary aim of poetry, Wordsworth differs from the neoclassics, who consider that the aim of poetry is to instruct and delight. However, Wordsworth's conception is that the proper function of poetry is to give pleasure. What sort of a pleasure? Purely aesthetic pleasure. His conception of pleasure is moral. Poetry does not merely provide momentary pleasure as is provided by drinking sherry or rope dancing. Poetry does provide momentary pleasure by the use of meter, rhyme, and other such ways which temper and soften even the most painful of emotions. Such pleasure is not the real aim of poetry. Poetry aims at a pleasure which is much higher, the pleasure which results from the realization of truth. It is a pleasure which results from inner enlightenment and from the strengthening and purification of emotions which poetry aims at. Poetry makes the readers sane and pure. Wordsworth also tells us that all good poetry is conceptualized by a man who possesses an unusual organic sensibility, and the poet has contemplated long and deeply over the matter. Wordsworth comments, I quote Wordsworth, the comment by Wordsworth is highly significant. He says, our feelings and emotions are modified and directed by our thoughts, which are indeed the representatives of our past feelings. With the habit thus formed, human feelings will be connected with the essential and permanent objects of nature. In this way, the general and universal laws of human life and nature would be discovered, which when rendered as poetry would enhance its understanding and result in the purification of emotions. Wordsworth hopes that his poems would extend the dominion of sensibility and ascertain delight and honor that would benefit human nature. He believes that it is his destiny to console the bereaved and make life happier so that the youngsters of every age would be led to see, think and feel and become active and virtuous. All this is not enough. We still have to know what Wordsworth has to tell us about the poet. What does Wordsworth tell us about the role of the poet? Does the poet have a different function to perform? Is the poet similar to the poet of the neoclassic age? According to Wordsworth, a poet is the upholder and preserver of general human nature. This means that the poet has the sensibility to record, to observe, as well as to communicate to us general human nature. He discovers universal laws of human nature and communicates them to his readers. In spite of differences of climate, language, manners, laws and customs, the poet binds together the diverse aspects of human society by his capacity to sympathize and share knowledge. The poet is a person who is gifted in his capacity to be able to understand the feelings of others, mostly the common man. Poetry is the first and last of all knowledge, as it is as immortal as the heart of man. Wordsworth emphasizes the fact that if the labors of man and science would ever create any material revolution, poetry would then act as a complement of science. Wordsworth states that the human mind is capable of being excited and does not require the application of gross and violent stimulants. I think I have already mentioned about gross and violent stimulants in the previous lecture, where we discussed that such gross and violent stimulants were found in the age of the neoclassics. Every person, according to Wordsworth, possesses the capacity to be elevated, and the degree of elevation differs according to individual capability. According to Wordsworth, the endeavor to produce or enlarge this capacity is one of the best services in which the poet can be engaged. Poetry, says Wordsworth, should purify the taste of the public and awaken their sensibilities. Wordsworth is here reacting against the excesses of the neoclassic age that gave a lot of importance to cheap emotions. Wordsworth has invincible faith in his poetry, which he thinks would enable people to discover the truth of nature in some unique and profound ways. His poetry is bound to make an audience for itself because of the widened sensibility, its fresh discovery of the truth of nature, and the new pleasure it would impart. Wordsworth's endeavour would be to discover something novel and original in the manifold beauty of nature and in the mind of man. Wordsworth advocates teaching or communicating the truth about the connection between nature and human perceptions to his readers. That would be the mission of his poetry. Wordsworth goes on to tell us about the connection or the interrelatedness between poetry, science and pleasure. A few minutes back, I just mentioned that pleasure is related to the communication of genuine human pleasure. What does Wordsworth mean by saying poetry gives pleasure? If poetry was to give pleasure, what do we define, or what do we call, or what do we mean by pleasure? Let's see what Wordsworth has to say. Poetry gives pleasure because, like science, it also pursues truth. And truth, when discovered and communicated, is always pleasurable. Poetry increases our knowledge of human life and human nature, and so it makes us wiser, nobler and better. The truths inherent in poetry are discovered not through intellect but through imagination and intrusion. The truth in poetry is universal and general, while the truth of science is personal and particular in nature. Wordsworth here draws a distinction between the truth of science and the truth of poetry. The truth of science can be enjoyed only by the scientists, while the truth of poetry is a common heritage of all, and so it becomes a source of pleasure to all the readers. For these reasons, Wordsworth believes that poetry is an immense force for the good of mankind. According to Wordsworth, benign tendencies are defined as relationship and love, which are considered pivotal to the functioning of poetry. Promulgation or transference of positive emotions can be achieved through purgation of feelings rather than by making an appeal to the intellect or good sense. Wordsworth here tries to tell us that the appeal to the intellect or good sense is temporary. It is not applicable always, because positive emotions, transference of positive emotions can be achieved only through feelings and not through the intellect. In this way, pleasure and instruction are reconciled and fused into a whole. Wordsworth's beliefs are different from the instructions of his predecessors. Let's now move on to find out how much original was Wordsworth when he wrote the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. The preface to the Lyrical Ballads is of immense critical value. It draws the dividing line between the beginning of a new era and the end of the earlier one. The new era definitely is a Romantic age, and the earlier one is a neoclassical period. The preface stands as a document that gives way to fresh ideas of thought with respect to art and literature. Wordsworth is an intellectual as well as the pioneer of the English Romantic criticism. He breaks new grounds which makes critical pronouncements to usher the age of Romanticism in England. In the preface, Wordsworth departs from the traditional view of poetry as imitation, and he holds the view that Romantic poetry is not an act of replication but that of self-expression. Romantic poetry is the expression of the poet's intimate emotions and passions, and not merely a simulation of external nature. Wordsworth therefore does not draw the traditional parallel between poetry and painting, but stresses the affinity of prose and poetry. Writing in the age of the French Revolution, Wordsworth seeks to democratize English poetry by his insistence on the simplicity of theme and diction in his verse. His preference for incidents and situations taken from humble and rustic life is in accord with the romantic glorification of common life. Wordsworth is similar to Rousseau in his advocacy of back to nature and condemnation of urbanity, which according to him dampens sensibility and leads to cheap sensationalism. Wordsworth lays emphasis on the role of imagination in the process of poetic creation. He extols imagination over reason. The themes taken from common life can be made interesting by coloring them with imagination. Let us not forget that Coleridge also gives a lot of importance to imagination. It is imagination which transforms and transfigures the common and makes the common appear unusual. It is through the function of imagination that a poet can acquire the insight which makes him see into the core of things and realize the truths which remain beyond the reasoning ability of the scientist. By relating poetry to the overflow of powerful feelings, he emphasizes the emotional and imaginative content of poetry. So far, we have seen the impact that the preface made to poetry, the impact, or you could say the contribution of the preface to the lyrical ballads was far more than people had actually expected. Let us now summarize the most important points that are to be included. Wordsworth incorporates changes in the second edition of the lyrical ballads, which is considered to be the most significant, and the inclusion of Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, as a last but one of the first volume of this edition. His democratic concept, the poet, is highly appreciated. He believes that the poet is one who has a heightened sensibility and a more comprehensive soul. The poet is one who is sensible to the pain and pleasures of the world. Wordsworth expresses his dissatisfaction with the poetry of the neoclassics that lacks compassion and authenticity of emotion. Imagination is crucial to the understanding of poetry. Wordsworth proclaims that the role of poetry lay in providing pleasure, albeit belonging to a higher order. Poetry has a power to combine the divergent aspects of society because of its latent power to provide knowledge of basic human emotions, and it serves as a connecting link between the various aspects of man and nature. This way, poetry becomes a vehicle that pursues truth and provides pleasure of the highest kind. So far, whatever we have seen is about the preface to the lyrical ballads and its contribution to the history of English criticism. We do have a few exercises for you, and I do hope that after you have answered the exercises, the ideas on the preface to the lyrical ballads would be clearer. We conclude this session. I would be meeting you in a new session with further suggestions and ideas from other critics and scholars. Till then, bye.